Civil liberties, our last lecture for the semester. I switched the order as far as the chapters in the book go because I find civil liberties particularly interesting. I find it's just a good way to end the semester. So here we go. Civil liberties are freedoms which are guaranteed to the individual, and those freedoms take the guarantees of restraints on the government, things that the government cannot do. So those are civil liberties. So the question becomes, if we have these civil liberties, why do they ever become an issue? If we've got the right to do something and there's restraints that the government can't do something, why do they ever become an issue? And they become an issue for three reasons. And we will take a look at each one of those reasons individually. But here, just so you understand the context of where we're going. First reason they become an issue is because constitutional rights are sometimes in conflict with each other. And passions can be inflamed by policy entrepreneurs, and then there are cultural conflicts that come to play that impact our civil liberties. So let's go back to the first one. Sometimes these constitutional rights we have are in conflict with each other. We give you the example here of order versus freedom. So the reason we even established the Constitution to form a more perfect union was because we wanted order, which was not had under the Articles of Confederation, but we are also trying to protect freedom. So those two things are inherently in conflict with each other. So let's give you some examples of that. The reality is, in the Constitution, there are many competing rights, not just order and liberty, but there are many competing rights. Principles that, again, that we're trying to protect, and sometimes we have to choose one over the other. For example, in the Constitution, we wanted to make sure that each individual is guaranteed a fair trial, but we also want to make sure that there is freedom of the press. So there's this case, Dr. Samuel H. Shepard. If you've ever seen the movie The Fugitive, it's loosely based on this. It's based on it from the perspective that if you've seen the movie, Harrison Ford is playing a surgeon who comes home with his wife one evening after a big gala party, and his wife goes into the house while he's pulling the car in the garage. This was in the 1960s when this happened. There were not garage door openers, so you had to get out of the car, open the garage door, usually unlock it, lift it up, get yourself back in the car, pull the car in, get out of the car, close the garage door down, lock it again, and then go in through the front door. That's oftentimes what happens. So while this is going on, Dr. Samuel H. Shepard's wife is in the house, and she is allegedly being murdered by a one-armed man, a man with one good arm and a prosthetic arm. And if you've seen the movie The Fugitive, this is exactly the scenario that is being portrayed. And then he goes in on this escape, and there's a manhunt and the whole bit. But at any rate, there was so much pre-trial publicity, which should be legal, right? Freedom of the press. That after Dr. Samuel H. Shepard was convicted, he appealed all the way up to the Supreme Court and argued that his constitutional right to a fair trial had been violated by the pre-trial publicity, or the freedom of the press. And the Supreme Court agreed, and he was actually let off because there was deemed no way for him to get a fair trial. And so these are these two rights in conflict. Another example, Pentagon Papers. Pentagon Papers were a stolen history of the Vietnam War. They were stolen during the Nixon administration. Now, it's interesting that the Vietnam War started with Democrats, our presidents, specifically John F. Kennedy, and then it widened with Lyndon B. Johnson. So what does Richard Nixon care if this secret history of the Vietnam War gets stolen and is going to be published by the New York Times? Well, what he didn't want was the precedent that anybody can just go in, rip off private documents of the government, and publish them. So what you have at issue are national security versus freedom of the press. Again, both are the very essence. National security, the very essence of being a nation. Freedom of press, one of the the premier freedoms of the Bill of Rights, freedom of the press. So you have those two issues in conflict with each other. And Carl Jacob Coons, he wanted to go to Skokie, Illinois, a predominantly Jewish city, town, and he wanted to give an anti-Jewish speech. This is after World War II in the 1960s, so World War II had been over less than 2 decades. Still very tender feelings about what happened in World War II with the Jews. Even to this day, understandably so, there are. But you could imagine the closer you get to that event, the more tender those feelings would be. And he wanted to give this speech in which he would argue the Jews should be burned in incinerators, which is exactly what happened in the Jewish concentration camps or internment camps. And the Jewish community in Skokie, Illinois, went to the courts to stop him, arguing order and security versus freedom of speech. And so those are the kind of conflicts you have in question with respect to civil liberties. Now, what happened, I said here, was Samuel H. Shepard really won. What happened with Pentagon Papers was the New York Times was allowed to print that, and Carl Jacob Coons, he was allowed to give the speech. So you might ask yourself the question, well, why? Well, there's a number of things that come into consideration when you look at those things and why the court allows one thing as opposed to another. One of the things that goes on is what is there a crisis? And if you go back and you look at the Pentagon Papers, when these were stolen, and threatened to be published, the public opinion had decidedly moved against the Vietnam War. So the court saw this as just part of the public discourse. Carl Jacob Coons, the Supreme Court has really put a premium on free speech, even over order and security. Now, it's not always the case. It's not always the case, but you can see there that that's certainly the case there. All right, so the success. Next topic. Passions can be inflamed by policy entrepreneurs, which also impact our civil liberties. Their success often depends upon a crisis. So you've got some crisis going on, and some policy entrepreneur makes some argument that our civil liberties should be inhibited, curtailed, brought back a notch because of the crisis that's going on. So with the Espionage and Sedition Acts in 1917 and 1918, what was going on was World War I. If you look at the dates here, the dates are very important because what had happened was in Russia, the war effort, Russia was one of our allies, the war effort is collapsing in Russia. And the Tsar actually has to abdicate his throne, and he and his family are murdered. And so you get the Reds taking over in Russia, and you get Mitchell Palmer, the Reds meaning the communists. You get Mitchell Palmer arguing that there were people in this country who were spies. German spies even. There's also this fear of communism going on. So Mitchell Palmer becomes the policy entrepreneur. The crisis was World War I, the fear of communism specifically, and just everything that was going on with World War I. Another example, the Smith Act of 1940 made it a crime to advocate the overthrow of the U.S. government by force. And the crisis, or the occasion, as I say it here, but it's the crisis, was World War II. Same exact dynamic going on. You had the Nazis are just wreaking havoc on the world. By now, Russia is fully communist, and you've got Joseph McCarthy, a senator, arguing the same thing, that there are individuals within the government and outside the government who are trying to infiltrate and turn the United States into a communist country. And so that is the crisis. And because of that, our civil liberties are restricted. You had individuals whose careers, lives were ruined even by the accusation of Joseph McCarthy. A third example, the Patriot Act, more recent in history. The occasion, of course, was 9/11. Policy entrepreneur George W. Bush, Bush number 43, the 43rd President of the United States, arguing that we needed to have these restrictions in order to protect ourselves, to prevent terrorists from flying airplanes into buildings and the like. And so there it is. You even had his second election, John Kerry arguing that the crisis is over, George Bush arguing that it wasn't. Bush won, and even today we still have lots of things in our country relative to the crisis that precipitated here with 9/11. In addition to passions being inflamed by policy entrepreneurs, you can have cultural conflicts that mitigate our civil liberties, that lessen our civil liberties. In the United States, when we began, we were a WASP nation. By WASP, I mean white Anglo-Saxon Protestant. So what it meant to be an American, was developed consistent along the lines of what it meant to be a WASP, a white Anglo-Saxon Protestant. So in other words, if you belong to the wrong religion, if you weren't a part of a Protestant religion, there's a problem. You were, not that necessarily you were ostracized, but some of your beliefs were ostracized. They weren't part of the mainstream. As the United States, as more and more immigration came to the United States, it would diversify our culture and challenge these traditional, quote, WASP values. So some examples. At Christmas, of course, we have these nativity scenes or creches. They are offensive to Jews. Jews don't believe that Jesus Christ was the Messiah, the Savior of the world. And so then to have these creches celebrate his life, his birth, his death, and all that, that's offensive to them, particularly if their tax dollars are being used to support it. What language should government documents be printed in? Should they be printed in Spanish? Should they be printed in Ebonics? Ebonics was a movement in Sacramento about 20 years ago, that there was a black language native to blacks in certain parts of the United States, that the reason some black kids didn't do well in school is because they were really at school had a second language, and that language was English. Their home language was Ebonics. And so there is this cultural conflict. They lost that argument, but there again, the Spanish really have not lost that argument. Lots of government documents are printed in Spanish. But again, there's this conflict. And then cultural conflicts. Religious practices, polygamy, veils, and driver's licenses all deal with these cultural conflicts. For instance, you see here in this picture from your book, should a Muslim woman be required to take her veil off for her driver's license ID? And the courts have said yes, it is not enough just to try to be able to identify somebody through their eyes. You've got to see their whole face. And even though it is a legitimate religious practice for them, there's an overriding cultural justification to restrict it. Some of these other issues we'll get into later on as we go throughout this lecture. Okay, so in our next little video, we'll pick up here with freedom of religion.